Welcome to the Broad Art Tell Me More Historical Fiction or Historical Voices webinar. I'm so excited to have you all here today. We have 6 amazing authors. 2 will be talking about nonfiction, and the other 4 will be talking about their new fiction books. Our moderator is Kate Shaw, MLIS, and is the district consultant for the Montgomery Public Library in Pennsylvania. And prior to this, Kate was Director of Collections and Technical Services at James V. Brown Library. And we're so excited to have Kate with us. Over to you, Kate.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm happy to be here. And we are going to start with Clara Bingham. Clara is an award-winning journalist and the author of Witness to the Revolution, Women on the Hill, and the co-writer of Class Action. And today she is going to talk to us about the movement. Welcome, Clara.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. And it's so exciting to talk to this community of important readers and proponents of reading. My book is an oral history of the early years of the women's liberation movement from 1963 to 1973. So it covers a whole decade, and it covers really the very beginning of the movement with Betty Friedan's publication of The Feminine Mystique and the civil rights movement, which led into very, lots of parts of the women's movement. And it ends in 1973 with Roe v. Wade being passed and Billie Jean King beating Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes, as well as the beginning of the National Black Feminist Movement. Organization which had a huge conference in 1973. So it was the beginning of that important part of the feminist movement, the Black feminist movement. But in between, you will hear from over 70 people and who come from all walks of life. And what makes this book different is there aren't any others, from what I know, that are oral history narratives and that cover so many different parts of the movement. And I cover sports. I interviewed the first woman who ran the Boston Marathon illegally in 1966. Her name is Bobby Gibb. I also talked to amazing artists who were part of the feminist art movement, like Judy Chicago and Faith Ringgold, as well as covering the political actors, the legal actors, like Brenda Fagan, who worked with Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the ACLU Women's Project. And all of these strains and parts of the movement were going on at the same time. And together, they created an explosive change in this country. And today, we really take it for granted. But it's important to remember that before Title IX, that passed in 1972, only 8% of professors were women. And many graduate programs excluded women. Medical school was about 3% women, same with law school. And women were just not in any of the white collar professions and were shut out of many labor, blue collar professions as well. And so it wasn't until the beginning of the EEOC, which I write about, and when women were able to bring their complaints of sex discrimination, that didn't start until 1965, to the forefront and begin to break open this entire world of being able to become who women really needed to be, depending on who they were and where they were from. This book is also, it addresses ethnic and racial diversity. I interview Native American women. I interview a lot of women who were Black feminists, but whose careers began in the civil rights movement. People like, I didn't interview them all because many of them were not alive. So those I needed to go back. Those who weren't alive, I went to the archives in important libraries like the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe and the feminist library at Duke University and Smith University, where they had amazing oral histories that were banked there, as well as papers that belonged to women like Florence Kennedy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Betty Friedan, who were no longer alive. But I track how important Black civil rights women like Fannie Lou Hamer were to the movement, and Pauli Murray, because they created the intellectual underpinnings for what became the second wave feminist movement. And they were really the moral leaders of the movement. And a lot of them have been left out of history. So I feel as if this book recalibrates the movement. It rebalances what really went on as much as I could tell it. And I didn't really tell it because it's told all in the very vibrant voices, first-person voices of the women who were in the room, who were on the front pages, who were in the streets protesting at the Miss America contest in Atlantic City in 1968. So I feel like this is an accessible history. It's not dense. It's easy to read. It reads like dialogue. It's funny. It's fun. And I hope you might find readers in your libraries who will be able to identify with it, especially younger readers. I think that's all for now, unless you have questions.
Thank you so much, Clara. So anybody who does have questions can put them in the chat. Elenita, I believe we'll do those at the end. I do have 1 or 2 questions for you, Clara, if we have time. To start off, I would love to know, obviously you got to speak to so many different kinds of women. Was there anything that you were surprised to learn during your interviews?
I guess I was surprised by so much. I was born in 1963, so the year this book begins, and I didn't realize how little women were really participating in the professional world. And one surprise I had was I interviewed several members of the class action that was the first class action ever for sex discrimination in a media company, or really any white collar company. It was Newsweek magazine. And they, in 1970, sued the magazine because women were not allowed to be writers or editors. They could only be fact checkers and mail girls. Even Nora Ephron went to the famous, amazing writer, went to interview at Newsweek, and they asked her, what would you like to do here? And she said, well, I want to be a writer. And they said, well, you can't do that at Newsweek. Women don't write here. And so 46 of them got together and surprised the magazine with a class action lawsuit. Eleanor Holmes Norton was their very brave, amazing lawyer. And 2 of the women I interviewed, Lynn Povich and Lucy Howard, were my bosses at Newsweek. And I went to work there in 1989, 4 years out of college, as a White House correspondent. And I walked in on the red carpet that they laid out for me. And of course, I didn't even know at the time about the lawsuit. No one was talking about it.
Wow.
So that's just one example of how I realized that my life was personally touched by the bravery of these second wave warriors.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Clara. We are going to move on to our next author, and we welcome Janet Skeslin Charles, who is going to talk to us about her book, Miss Morgan's Book Brigade. She is the New York Times and international best-selling author of the Paris Library as well. Welcome, Janet. Please talk to us about your book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Bonjour de Paris. Hello from Paris. Thank you, everyone, for being here today with us. I'm excited to talk about the real-life characters in my new book, Miss Morgan's Book Brigade. I came across this book when I was researching Dorothy Reeder, the librarian who defied the Nazis in the Paris Library. I was digging around in the American Library Association archives when I discovered that in 1918, during the Great War, an elusive librarian named Jessie Carson traveled to France, where she created something that did not yet exist here, children's libraries. After the war, she transformed ambulances into bookmobiles. So you can see why a book lover like me would be completely obsessed. My search for Jessie took me from her native Pittsburgh to the West Coast and to New York, where Jessie was hired by Anne Morgan, daughter of the financier J.P. Morgan, to head up the library section of the American Committee for Devastated France. In French, it was called Le Comité Américain pour les Régions Dévastées, or CARD. Volunteers who referred to themselves as CARDs signed up for 6-month stints, spoke French, and had a driver's license so they could work as chauffeurs. Most were from wealthy families who paid for their own uniforms, ocean passages, and other expenses. Jessie Kit Carson was one of the few salaried employees, and she signed a contract for 2 years. I got to know Jessie through the memoir of one of her fellow Cards, Mary Needham, who wrote, "Kit was Irish, and with it the power of entering deeply into the loves and hates of her friends. She had a distinct code of friendship based on belligerent loyalty." Now, anyone who's belligerent, I can get behind. When I read that, I knew Jessie and I would get along just fine. Needham described life during the war. Offenses were taking place everywhere. Events happened so quickly. Activity became so feverish that from one day to the next, we had no opportunity to recover from the fatigue. More than 100 miles we traveled that day over shell-torn roads, I riding rumble seat without any springs. When I arrived, I fell into my bed from utter exhaustion. I was awakened by Kit's voice, but I was too tired to answer. "Get up," she said, "there's an air raid. Get up, the Germans are coming." "Let them come," I said. By that time, Kit was upon me like a Boston policeman. "You will get up," she said between her teeth as she flung her bedclothes off me, leaving me shivering. I did get up. So that tells you a little bit about the character of Jessie Carson, who was born in 1876. At the turn of the century, she trained to be a librarian, and after 2 years of study, received a certificate and began working in the children's section of the Pittsburgh Library. In 1907, she moved to Tacoma, Washington. A year later, her children's section was declared the most advanced in the library. According to the Tacoma Times, Miss Carson's fervent eloquence has won her a warm corner in the hearts of her little devotees. A few years later, Miss Carson is recognized as the leading children's librarian of the entire Pacific Northwest. But then the next headline read, "Jessie Carson goes to New York." Perhaps feeling that she'd accomplished all that she could, Jessie wanted another challenge. Or perhaps she wanted to live closer to her sister and mother in Pennsylvania. In 1914, Jessie began working under one of the most formidable librarians in history. And as a novelist, I couldn't help but wonder, what would it feel like to go from director to assistant, from being in charge to following orders? And would the move to the New York Public Library be worth a demotion? Let's just say that when Anne Morgan handpicked Jessie Carson to lead the committee's library program in war-torn France, 40 miles from the front, Jessie jumped at the chance to lead. I think we can look at that. I think we can look at the slide if you can, just so you have it's sometimes I like to put a name to a face. So Anne Morgan was actually in France when World War I broke out. And in Versailles, she opened her home to convalescing soldiers. She then returned to New York to do what she did best, raise awareness and a lot of money. She and her longtime love, a Scottish doctor named Anne Murray Dyke, founded CARD. Mary Needham wrote, "We in the organization thought of them together. Big Anne and Little Anne, we called them, affectionately, but not to their faces." So these two women were received the Croix de Guerre, the War Cross Medal, for their courage under fire when they helped the French civilians vacate when the German bombs started to fall. This story is really my research. I fell in love with Jessie Carson, and I fully expected her to return to the New York Public Library after 2 years. She was loaned out like a library book, not 2 weeks, but for 2 years. And I assumed she would go back. And I searched and searched, and I did not find a trace of her. It took me about 10 years to find out what happened to her. And so this book is that search. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. You kind of already answered partly my question. in two ways. The idea of spending more than a decade getting to know Jessie, and you mentioned that you discovered her when you were already doing research. Is that normal for you that you're researching multiple subjects at the same time? Or can you tell us a little bit about your research process?
I'm not sure about how the other authors on this panel work, but if I have a choice between writing and not writing, I'll choose not writing. So I'm usually working on a few projects at the same time. So when I get stuck on one, I can kind of just move on to the other. And then when I'm stuck on the second one, I can go back to the first.
That's wonderful. Also, so your first two books have focused on, these two books have focused on libraries and librarians, and obviously your crowd is librarians. Is that what we should expect in the future from you as well?
Well, my first book was actually about email order brides in Odessa, Ukraine.
Pardon me.
So I think you never know. I am working on the third installment of my library trilogy. And I would love to return to Odessa, Ukraine one day. It's an incredible city with amazing people. But I've loved my time in the library.
Wonderful. And I'm sure we've loved having you in our libraries. And also, as a Pennsylvanian, I have to say I'm excited about your book because I'm from Pennsylvania. However, go Birds, not Pittsburgh for me. So we are going to move on to Jason Stanley. Jason, welcome. Jason Stanley is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, and he is here today to talk to us about his nonfiction title, Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Jason, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be speaking to librarians whom this book is written for. So I wish this book were fiction, but it's not. This book places the book bans in libraries and schools into historical and transnational perspective. What I'm trying conceptually to do is link the erasure of histories to the attack on democracies, because that's international. Janet mentioned Ukraine. Let's take Ukraine and Russia as an example. Why do Russians support the war in Ukraine? Well, their textbooks are entirely, their textbooks have erased the history of Ukraine as an independent country. They've erased the history of Ukraine as an independent history. If you included the history of Ukraine, specifically what has happened to Ukrainians, you would include Holodomor, the genocide of Ukrainians during the Soviet Union. And as the journalist Victoria Amelina wrote, you can't teach a genocide because then people might recognize other genocides. In the Soviet Union, we were not taught the history of Holodomor or the Holocaust. Victoria Amelina was assassinated by the Russians, and afterwards they bombed her funeral and killing many of her family members. So journalists give you histories and perspectives, and that's why they are the enemies of authoritarianism. In the United States, Toni Morrison, our Nobel Prize winner in literature, who comes from a traditionally oppressed group, her work has been the subject of repeated book bans. Well, look internationally at Hungary. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán has removed the only Nobel Prize winner in literature from Hungary since World War II, who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, from the curriculum. Because in countries like the United States and Hungary, which are falling into authoritarianism and one-party states, the perspective of non-dominant groups is threatening. So the question is, why, whenever we get an attack on democracy, we get the erasure of histories? Now, note that the banning of certain concepts is the erasure of history. So if you ban the concept of structural racism, which is illegal to teach not just in Tennessee public schools, but also in Tennessee universities. You can go online and pull the reporting form from the state of Tennessee to report your professor at any state university for teaching about structural racism. Now, what is structural racism? It's the histories of structures. In the case of racial hierarchies, for instance, in housing. In New Haven here, we have it's majority non-white, but the wealthy neighborhoods are all white. So if you eliminate study of structural racism, you're eliminating Black history, because Black history is not just the history of great individuals, it's the history of the structures that underlie racism. So the elements of what we see. So I draw what's happening into America. I put it in international perspective. It needs to be put into international perspective because I just got back from Tennessee, and the Tennessee State Legislature just passed a resolution praising Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, the autocratic leader of Hungary. All of this is happening universally. And I'll close just with one more example, which is completely universal whenever you see authoritarian attacks, the attack on LGBT. The attack on LGBT, the idea is we can't teach decadent works. This is straight out of the Nazis, who had a broad conception of obscenity to target LGBT and Jewish writers. So here we target LGBT and Jewish writers and Black writers. So when you erase perspectives, you attack equal respect between when a minority group doesn't have their perspective represented, then they don't have their voices represented in democracy. And then you represent hierarchies as impossible to challenge because you erase the history of social movements that have challenged them. So what we see today is a fascist social and political movement, which has already ended democracy in many US states and threatens the country.
Thank you, Jason. So obviously these are long-standing issues. However, this book is very timely, especially librarians. We've seen such an increase in book bans. What kind of time frame, like from conception to publishing, did you have to write this book really fast?
Yes, I wrote it. I started it in August. I knew that we were headed to into an election. I needed to be in the media all the time, putting in perspective what's going on here and internationally. So I knew I just had to get it done.
Wow. So previous books of yours have been how propaganda works, how fascism works. What are you going to teach us about next?
About what?
What are you going to teach us about next? What's your next book?
Oh, my next book. I am giving myself I published a book, an academic book in November. I'm going to give myself a slight break, but hopefully a third book on the authoritarian movements we see. This is on education. And how fascism works was about the structure of fascism. The third book will be probably about fascism and patriarchy.
Well, I hope you enjoy your, sounds like very well-deserved break.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on next to our next author, another fiction title. And this is, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce her first name. Kate McIntosh, and her book, The Champagne Letters. Kate is always in search of a perfect bottle of wine, a great book, and a swoon-worthy period costume drama. Welcome, Kate. Thank you for coming to talk to us about The Champagne Letters.
Thank you so much, Kate. I feel like I'm talking to myself. And I want to thank all the librarians. I don't know about anyone else, but have the fondest memories of summer reading programs and working my way through various things. So I'm so happy to be a part of this presentation. The novel, The Champagne Letters, for me was this perfect opportunity. And I was so enjoying when I was listening to Janet talk about this sense of you go down these rabbit holes of things that are fascinating and you don't know where they're going to lead you. So I've always loved, obviously, Paris and history, a little bit about con artists, women that maybe history's forgotten, and of course, wine. If there's ever an excuse to learn more about wine, I'm very open to that. The novel, it's a dual timeline story. So in the present day, there's Natalie Taylor, who has decided to sort of run off to Paris for a vacation after a recent divorce. So she's definitely feeling a little bit adrift. She thought she knew where her life was going. And after, 25 years marriage and turning 50, things have gone in a direction she didn't expect. And when she's in Paris, she has the chance at one of these bookstalls to come across a book of letters by the founder of the Champagne house, Veuve Clicquot. And she uses that book of letters as an inspiration to rebuild her own life, even when things take a little bit of an unpleasant turn on her trip. In the history, of course, I based it on the real life woman, Barbara Nicole Clicquot, who became a widow in the early 1800s. And she was determined to see her and her husband's goal of having the premier champagne house come to pass. Now, of course, to do that, she had to deal with, some Russians who were invading, competitors. This is the time period where champagne was becoming suddenly very popular. The Napoleonic court, and of course, not to mention, of course, she also had to smuggle all of her wines out of France because it was during the war. Now, I first heard about the widow. I actually had the opportunity to live in Belgium in my mid-20s. And so one of the things we did is we found any and all excuses to go to various wine tastings and champagne tastings. And one of the houses was the House of Veuve Clicquot. And I remember at the time thinking, what an amazing and fascinating woman. And I actually wrote her name down in my journal as someone I wanted to know something more about. Now, at the time, I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't confusing that with, say, actually writing. So I wasn't completing any projects. I just sort of made a note to myself that she would make an amazing character. And then if you sort of fast forward about 10 years after that, I came across, there's a biography called The Widow Clicquot by Tilliar Mazzio, which is an amazing nonfiction book on the topic. And when I read it, I just became even more consumed with the fact that this woman is fascinating. So, Clara, when she was talking about her books and the movement, she talked about how little rights women had in 1963. Well, it certainly wasn't much better in the early 1800s. The only reason she could even open a champagne house was because her husband had died. So widows were allowed to own a business, was the only reason you could. Possibly for that reason, she never did remarry. She wanted to definitely keep the house as her own. She took several lovers, several who would say like, well, perhaps I can help you with that business. But that wasn't the help she was certainly looking for at the time. She was a very smart businesswoman. She certainly moved the process of champagne making forward. And I was just fascinated by her. And then when I had my own divorce, I also ran off to France for a period of time, which is always a good answer. And so that was really where the genesis of the book started for me. And I began writing. And I really wanted to bring her story to life. So many people on this panel, I can tell, also have this huge passion for history and research. And it is so easy to go down those rabbit holes. And for, I think, us as writers, it feels as live as the present day does. And so it's just sort of this all-consuming situation. I love writing, and the chance to sort of play with these characters, both imaginary and those based on real people, was fantastic. It gave me an excuse to travel to France. It gave me an excuse to buy all the research books that I wanted. And it certainly gave me an excuse to drink all the wine, purely for research reasons, of course. So that was it. And I just wanted to read the first few lines from the book because I felt what I wanted to do was to give a story to the widow. And so I just thought that she should start the book off with that. If a woman does not tell her own story, then a man will surely do it for her. And even if he is a good man, he will be incapable of telling it true. Instead, he will twist and turn the woman in question to fit his own imagination and preferences. He will recast events, experiences, so that he is the master of her story. In my 89 years of experience, including surviving that toad Napoleon in the war, I have learned that men always see themselves as the fulcrum that determines the balance of women and the world. If they had any idea how much is decided for them by the women in their lives, they would be shock. They mistake grand gestures for strength and disregard the quiet iron that underlies soft things. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kate. That was beautiful. So writing a book that had that dual time period and also especially those dual voices, your point of view, did you find it was difficult to switch voices from Barbara Nicole to Natalie?
Yes. And in fact, what I ended up doing during the editing process was printing out the book and separating it into 2 books so that you could read just the present time storyline and make sure that that felt consistent and solid. And then going back and reading the past timeline. It was really important to me that those both feel like really engaging stories. I didn't want readers to be like, oh, I just want to get through this part so I can jump over to this story. So it was a little bit of a challenge, but it was one that I enjoyed.
Wonderful. And who was your favorite to write?
That's like asking a parent, right? Like which one? It's a Sophie's choice.
I'm a childless cat lady. I can do that.
I'll join you in that. I'm a childless without even cats. It's even sadder. I would say the present day storyline had a lot in common with myself. So I think what I really enjoyed was the past, and I enjoyed this chance to see this woman who I just thought of as remarkable. And she has in one of her letters, she makes a comment that she knows her voice will be lost to time because she's both a woman and a merchant, and therefore inconsequential. And I just relished this opportunity to give her a voice. It just was so pleasurable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. And we are going to move on now to our next author, the author of The Lion Women of Tehran. This is Marjan Kamali. Hello, Marjan. You were born in Turkey to Iranian parents and hold a degree from UC Berkeley, Columbia University, and New York University. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, please?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Kate, and I'm thrilled to be here. I grew up moving a lot, and whenever we moved, one of the first places my mom would take us to so we could feel grounded was the local library. So it's very meaningful to be speaking to librarians. And I would love to share with you how I came to write The Lion Women of Tehran. This is my 3rd novel. And after my 2nd one came out, I was working on the next one, but then the pandemic began and we were all in lockdown. And as I was scrolling through Instagram, I came across these posts from a friend of mine. And she and I were friends not just on social media, but once upon a time we had been best friends in elementary school in Tehran. And we had played together almost every day, and we had done our homework together. We had shared our dreams about the kinds of women we'd grow up to be. But we also shared our fears because we were young girls living during a time of war. This was during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And we were also living in an autocratic state. So I spent many nights in the basement as the air raid sirens went off. And every time I made it back up, I was keenly aware of this chance I'd been given to live. And so when my family did leave Tehran in a rush without saying goodbye to my best friend, I had that same feeling of being the one who got away. But I arrived in New York City at the age of 10, determined to live doubly hard for both of us. And so when I was looking again at this friend's posts so many decades later, I thought about the different directions our lives had taken. I mean, here I was now an author telling stories in America, and there she was working for a human rights organization in Iran. And I kept thinking about how these friends we make when we are children truly shape us, and their influence on our lives lasts, even if the friendship doesn't. And I think we all know friendship breakups can be just as heart-wrenching as romantic ones. And so I put away those other pages I had already started, and I started this book, The Lion Women of Tehran. And in this book, we follow the story of a broken friendship. We see the 2 characters, Ellie and Homa. We see them form a fast friendship, even though they come from very different backgrounds as children. They go through the joys of girlhood, the ups and downs of adolescence. They go off to university together, and then one of them betrays the other. But decades later, they reunite in America. And all along, one of them, Homa, fights for Iranian women to be free. I think something a lot of people don't know is that the women's rights movement in Iran is over a century old. The first women's rights organization was established in the 1920s. And it was listening to hear Clara talk about 1963. That's the year Iranian women got the right to vote. But a middle-aged woman or an elderly woman in Iran today lives with the fact that she had more rights growing up than her daughters or her granddaughters can have. And I was more than halfway done with writing The Lion Women of Tehran when a real woman named Mahsa Jina Amini was arrested for wearing improper hijab in Iran and killed. And like many Iranians in the diaspora, I watched with both hope and heartbreak as women and girls took to the streets because they had had enough of their lives being controlled by authoritarian men. And the courage of these women was astounding. So I knew I had to honor them. And I always go back to that E.L. Doctorow quote, where he says that the power of fiction is it helps us not just see what happened in history, but how what happened made people feel. And so with this book, I hope to show you that texture of friendship, how our childhood friends remain calcified in our neural pathways, in our hearts, even in certain foods. Like I still remember the birth dates of my old friends, even if we're no longer friends. And you can feel it in the touch of a fabric of a t-shirt that reminds you of what you used to wear. So I was hoping to capture all those many angles of friendship, but also to show the vibrancy and the courage and the complexity of these two girls from Iran who I made up, but who are very real to me.
Thank you, Marjan. So this sounds, while not actually autobiographical, but really rooted in your own experience and life, with New York and Tehran. And can you tell us a little bit about researching a period of 30 years and not your 30 years that you were experiencing? What was that like for you?
Yeah, these were not my 30 years because the friendship takes place in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, and another time period I can't share because it's a spoiler. But I drew heavily, like all the other authors who've spoken, I did a lot of research. There's so many resources, obviously in nonfiction books, online, even YouTube, to bring to life that world. However, the most rewarding and beneficial source I had was my mom's memories. So I spoke to her at great length, and I deliberately made my two characters, Ellie and Homa, exactly born when my mom was, so that I could ask her, well, what was it like when you were in high school? And what did you wear when you were in college? And tell me about what you had for lunch when you would go off on your lunch breaks. So that was an incredible resource for me and a wonderful way to research the book.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that we forget that oral histories of our own families are just as important as the big names of the day or whatnot. Thank you. And also, does the book come with tissues?
It does not, but it probably should.
Okay. All
Because
right.
there's a lot of crying, but it's the good cry, the
Good
healing cry.
Thank you so much, Marjan. And we are going to move on to our very last speaker of the afternoon, Greer McAllister and her book, The 13th Husband. Greer's historical novels, including The Magician's Lie, Girl in Disguise, Woman 99, and The Arctic Fury, have been named Book of the Month, Indie Next, Library Reads, Target Book Club, and Amazon Best Book of the Month picks, and have been optioned for film and television. Greer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And this has been just amazing to hear the stories that everybody's bringing in terms of these books that are on offer. And it makes me want to just go and read all of them. But I have to talk about my book first. So my book is The 13th Husband. It is the story of a scandalous socialite named Amy Crocker. The book is fiction, but the woman is real. She was a railroad heiress in the 1880s. She inherited $10 million upon the death of her father when she was 10 years old. And that is, at least if the internet can be trusted on this matter, about $300 million in today's money. So she was absolutely rolling in it. Her mother got some money, her sister got some money, she got some money. Her mother was called Lady Bountiful in Sacramento. She endowed, homes for orphans and museums. Her sister was very respectable and grew up to be a congressman's wife in New York. Amy chartered a boat and sailed around the world, went to Hawaii, did all sorts of scandalous things. She got tattoos. She shocked the society. She married a succession of men in their 20s, even as she went from 17 years old to 60 years old. The name of the book is The 13th Husband. I will leave it to the readers because it is a spoiler to say whether there are 13 actual husbands or whether there's a bit more going on behind the scenes. But she did, it is a matter of the historical record that she did get married a number of times. And Wikipedia, her Wikipedia page alone is a wild, wild ride. So if you're going to read the book, you might not want to read that. But I did have to make some adjustments to her story to make it actually plausible fiction. Because I think, as the other fiction writers among us know, just because something happened doesn't make it sound like a realistic thing that could take place. My best example from Amy's actual life was if I had written this as a completely fictional novel, I could not have shown that at the end, when she married her first husband, the first thing that happened on their honeymoon is the train that they were traveling on went off the rails and was involved in a train wreck. And that would have been a little bit too on the nose because, in fact, her first marriage went off the rails and it was a sort of train wreck. So if I'd written it, my editor would have said no to, metaphor ? But in fact, that is what happened. So that is an episode from history that I included in Amy's story. So where her money came from is the Transcontinental Railroad, the Crocker family. One of the Big Four was a Crocker. His brother was the lawyer for the Big Four, and that's who Amy's father was. So she was sort of a kind of California royalty and celebrity culture before we had the internet, before we had television. But they did have tabloids. So she was a tabloid fixture from the time that she was very, very young, and had the same sort of relationship with the tabloids that I think a lot of very famous women do today, that she was elevated and followed and loved, but also vilified and judged and just trashed on the front page. So that's part of the through line of the story. And then there's this supernatural element to the story that I did also draw from Amy's actual life, the stories that she told. Amy wrote a memoir late in life. It was called And I'd Do It Again. If you have any questions about how Amy's public persona was, she was very confident and just swatting about and throwing parties and being just a woman with no regrets, which is, of course, not actually how most people live. And so her public persona, her public confidence was masking some private pain. So as Marjan said, being able to use the tools of historical fiction to not just talk about things that happened, but people's feelings, and the fact that history is made up, yes, of movements, but also of individuals. And so this woman is a very unusual woman of her time, right? She has the privilege to do what she wants and be who she wants, but she was still judged. She was still trapped in some of the institutions and the patterns that we have even today. I mean, I talk a lot about women in my historical fiction from sort of the 1850s up to the 1910s. And one of the things we get to see is how far we've come. And then what we also get to see is, but have we come that far? Especially as progress is not entirely a forward we would love it if it were forward rolling, but it rolls in some other directions as well. So I always say historical fiction is not just about the past. And I think Amy's story is a very interesting story, both in the time that it took place, and then even to look at her today as an example of a woman who has that confidence, who lives her life to the fullest as either an aspirational thing or a cautionary tale. So because of the supernatural mystical element, my publisher has said that it's sort of somewhere between the Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and The Haunting of Hill House. I consider it's a beach read, it's a book club read, it's for people who are interested in women's stories and historical fiction, and also that sort of supernatural element that draws you in and gives you as the reader a mystery to solve. And the Library Journal gave it a lovely review. It said that it is sure to be a hit with fans of Susan Meisner, Alison Pataki, and Marie Benedict, all of whom I consider friends of mine and admire very much. So when I read that, I'm like, that's great. That's great. I hope it is a hit with those people, because that's a lot of people. So that's The 13th Husband.
Thank you. I think it sounds like you're in excellent company there then. So we've heard a little bit from some of our other authors about, you know, these historical figures and kind of when they fell in love with them or knew that they wanted to write about them. How did you get to know Amy? When did you know that you wanted to write a book about her? Did you find her in her memoir or somewhere else?
I actually found her because my husband found her for me. So during the research process for The Arctic Fury, I was looking for real women of the 1840s and 1850s, because that book is more of a what if story. What if Lady Jane Franklin, whose husband had disappeared in the Arctic, she had sent a bunch of different expeditions looking for him. What if she had gotten sick of the fact that all of the men she sent looking for him failed, and if she decided to send women instead? So it's an interesting period of history that women were on the California Trail and the Oregon Trail. There were women who were very much staying in their role, but there were women who were very much taking risks and doing things that sound kind of surprising today. So he sent me a list of women that he had found, and Amy she wasn't right for that book because her adventures were different types of adventures, and she was born in the 1860s, but didn't really start making her mark until a little bit later. But after I had taken a bit of a side turn into fantasy, I was writing sort of a feminist matriarchal Game of Thrones series, which is also available. But when I decided I wanted to get back into historical fiction again, I was looking through my notes and I found Amy and said, oh, okay, is she interesting enough? Is there enough for a book in Amy? And in fact, there was too much for a book, and I really had to tone it down and narrow it and streamline it. And again, make it make sense as fiction, because reality doesn't always, and the historical record doesn't always make for a satisfying reading experience. So I would be a terrible, terrible nonfiction writer. And I have great respect for the nonfiction writers among us. But I like to be able to stitch a story together from the elements that I find.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Elenita, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we have any questions from our attendees, I believe. But once again, I'm Kate Shaw. I want to thank our wonderful panelist of authors, and their books are available.
I don't see any questions, but do any of you want to say anything else? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was really a great webinar. I enjoyed everyone's stories. Now, of course, I want to read everyone's books. And Jason, I look forward to hearing you on different talk shows talking about your book. And we want to thank our sponsors, your publishers, as well as you again. And Kate, thank you. You're a great moderator. Books are available at Brodart, and we are going to stop the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.